Hi and welcome. This week I'm going to be doing a review on our GTS 1300 wood chipper. Now this is the third mulcher or wood chipper that we've owned. The first one was a Rover machine, and we bought that around 30 years ago. And that machine was suitable really for small stuff like leaves, rose prunings and that sort of work. That used a vertical shaft engine, and the actual blades, it used a gang of 3 blades that hung off the bottom of that vertical shaft. It wasn't actually supported on the bottom, which meant after a few years usage, the shaft actually bent when something a little too big went through the machine and it jammed. So that was the end of that machine, but we got about 5 or 6 years usage out of that machine before it was fatally injured. After that we went for a yard machines machine. And that machine had a plastic chute on one side that you could actually pivot down and rake leaves straight into it. It also had a little bit more horsepower than the Rover that it replaced. And it had a chipping chute on the other side, which you could put branches up to just over an inch through. And we found that we were using the chipping chute more than the larger chute, which was for leaves. Now that larger chute actually used a series of hammers to break up the material. So when you put leaves and small material through it, it actually produced a really nice fine mulch. But the chipping action left a little bit to be desired because you really couldn't put the larger material through it. So we decided to trade that one in on this particular machine. This is a GTS 1300, which is manufactured by GTM Professional Machines, and it's imported into Australia by Crommelins. Crommelins are well known in Australia for importing and sales and service of large generator sets and other machinery. Now I think these machines were imported into Australia without their stationary engine, because you will find them on the internet with a number of different engines fitted, whether they're Honda or Subaru in our case. We actually had a Subaru Robin 13.5 horsepower engine fitted to this wood chipper when we first bought it. I have since replaced that engine with another one because the original engine developed quite a major fault. But I'll go into that a little bit later. Now with these larger machines, they usually come in 2 different types. There's the ones that use a drum chipper, which is this particular machine. It has a rotating drum with 2 blades on it. And those blades pass an anvil that is fixed into the body of the machine with a small gap in between, and that generates the chipping action. It also means that they have a tendency to self-feed to a certain degree, particularly with softer and smaller materials, though you will find with larger and dry material that it will not feed that well unless you actually force it. Now the other type of machine is a disc chipper, and they have a rotating disc with a number of fixed blades, again, that pass a stationary anvil in the machine. The only downside of the disc chippers is that you can get wind up if you get stringy material around the shaft, and I've never had that problem with this particular machine. So I think that particular problem just isn't an issue with drum type chippers. Now there are also a number of knockoffs of this machine that are sold through eBay, which are made in China with Chinese engines, so I can't really say what the quality is like of those particular machines. We've had a pretty good run out of this machine, though one of the biggest enemies of any form of wood chipper is vibration, and a lot of that vibration comes from the chipping action when you're putting material through it. When those blades actually strike particularly dry material, the machine will vibrate, and that can cause metal fatigue and other problems. Well, I'll just go through the layout of the machine in general. We've got our stationary engine here. Originally that was, as I said, a 13.5 horsepower Subaru Robin engine. I've since replaced it with a 16 horsepower Chinese motor when the original engine failed. I'll show you what the problem was with that engine over on the bench a little bit later. So this is the main feed chute here. The drum is actually located down here, and I'll show you the drum by pivoting the exit chute out of the way a little bit later. So both these chutes can be pivoted out of the way so you can actually gain access to the drum to clear blockages. Now the motor actually drives the drum with a double belt drive on the other side of the machine. And there's also a number of safety features with this machine. There's an emergency stop button for your foot just in front of the stationary engine there. There's also one up here on top of the input chute. And there's also two micro switches that disable the ignition system if you pivot the exit or the feed chute out of the way for cleaning blockages. But rather than rely on those solely, I always remove the plug cap before clearing any blockage on this particular machine. Well, let's pivot this exit chute out of the way and I'll show you the actual drum itself. Now I've already removed the plug cap, so to rotate the drum round you take off this plastic cover on the end here so you can manually rotate it with this special tool that's provided. So we'll just take this end cap off. We'll just take the special tool off. Now we'll just remove these two bolts here. This allows the chute to pivot. Now as we rotate this drum around, you'll see the blades come into view. So there are the bolts that hold the blade on, and that's the actual blade. It's got a few chips in it after a few years of usage, but it's still in pretty good condition and chips quite well. These blades are actually also reversible, I'm told. So you can actually take them off and reverse them, and there's another blade on the other end of it as well. So you can sort of see there's the cavity on the inside there. That's what the chips go into, and that's what, as this rotates this way, it flings it up the chute and out. As I said before, vibration is really the biggest enemy of wood chippers, and the problems I've had with this particular machine is the pivot points for the input chute. Now the chute pivots up on these two pins here, which are welded onto the input chute itself, and both pins have fractured right where they go into the body here. And really it's a design flaw. They just machined these pins down here, and there wasn't really a radius on where it was reduced down, so that was a stress point and it fractured. So I had to drill these two pins out and put some steel rod in there. It's just an interference fit, but it seems to work quite well. I may weld those in properly if they come loose, but for the moment it's working fine. The only other issue I've had with metal fatigue has been with this bracket here, which holds the belt guard on. It was just bent at right angle here. It was a sharp bend, so it fatigued along that edge on the inside edge of that bend there. So I've run a bead of weld right along there, and that seems to have cured that problem. The only other issue I've had is with the Subaru stationary engine, as I said, so we'll go over to bench and have a look at what went wrong with that engine. Well, here's the Subaru Robin 13.5 horsepower engine that was on our wood chipper, and the fault that it developed on this engine was that it actually developed a crack in the crankcase of all things, and the crankcase itself is quite expensive, and it was certainly a lot cheaper to replace the entire engine than to buy the spare part itself. Apart from that, this engine runs flawlessly, and I'm sure I could probably get that crack welded at some stage and use this as a backup engine. So I'll just show you where the crack is. And it's very hard to see, but the hairline crack just starts here in this corner here and runs in on the casting there. And it's been getting larger over time. And it just weeps out oil, particularly when the engine is running or the machine is left standing for a few weeks of time. Now the machine is also fitted with a guide on the side here for materials that you can put through the machine. It recommends nothing over 45mm in dry wood and 75mm in green wood. Now that really will depend on the type of wood that you put through it, whether it's a softwood or a hardwood and how it dries. I found it's a bit of a guide. Certainly with dry materials, some timbers will not go through this machine at 45mm. you can usually get a lot less through. And with green timber, some timbers will actually go through this machine really well, whereas other green timbers will not go through, and you're limited in sizes that you can put through it. So in reality, this is really just a rough guide only. And what it doesn't tell you is what sort of other materials you can put through the machine. Leaves will go through quite well, though it will not produce a particularly fine mulch with leaves, I find. And you will have some issues with stringy materials in that they will have a tendency to clog the output shaft. And certainly the same can be said for anything that's wet. You really should avoid putting wet material through the chipper unless you want to spend your time cleaning the machine out during operation. Because what you have to remember is that that material needs some mass and needs to be flung out the chute. It actually uses the centrifugal force of the material being caught up in the little cavity behind the blade to actually fling it up that output chute and onto the pile. And I find with lightweight stringer material, it just has a tendency to just get caught in that chute. So if you do have some material that is difficult to get through the chipper, I find it's best if you mix it with other woodier materials, which will actually have a bit of mass to them, which will help fling them out of that output chute. So that's really the materials handling. I'll do a little bit of a live demonstration of putting materials through it, and I'll put that in at around this point so you can get an idea of what it's like to use the machine. Okay, before we start, I should mention a few safety recommendations. Obviously, you should have good ear protection and eye protection. I'm using a pair of earmuffs that are mounted to a face shield. You could use safety glasses if you didn't have a face shield, but I certainly recommend a full face shield when using a wood chipper, because you can get items spat out the back. Even though there is a rubber curtain there, occasionally an item will come out. Another good thing to have is a pair of good gloves, particularly if you're handling anything with thorns, such as blackberries or anything that has sharp edges on it. The other thing you'll also find is that if you're putting in long branches, when they contact the actual chipper blades, you'll actually get quite a severe vibration back through your hands, and having the gloves to cushion you from that vibration will also make it a much less painful experience. Okay, we'll move on to starting the unit. Okay, first you need to make sure that all your safety switches are in the off position, and turn your stationary engine on, fuel tap on. Most stationary engines have a fairly similar setup to this. The controls will vary a little bit, but they're usually in pretty much the same place. Choke on, about half throttle, and then Well, I hope you liked that demonstration of this particular machine, the GTS 1300 wood chipper from GTM, which is distributed in Australia by Crommelins. You know, apart from the issues I've had with this machine, I must admit though, the cracked crankcase is a fairly major issue, and it really does show you the flaws of wood chippers in general, in that the design needs to take into account the vibration issues. Whether that was a freak accident on this particular machine or whether that is a common problem on this range of machines, I can't really say. I've had this Chinese motor on for probably a few months now, and it certainly seems to be running really well with that on. In fact, it actually starts slightly easier than the Subaru engine, and it just seems as powerful, if not more powerful. This engine is actually rated at 16 horsepower rather than 13.5 of the Subaru, but I'd take Chinese horsepower with a grain of salt if I were you. The machine is certainly fast and effective at chipping, not so good on leaves and smaller lightweight material like that, because it does have a tendency to go straight through the machine with little change. But certainly if you want to chip prunings and branches, this is certainly the sort of machine you should be looking at, particularly if you've got a large property. It's certainly easy to fill this trailer very quickly to the brim. If you've got all your material prepared, it's certainly worthwhile cutting off side branches and cutting material to manageable lengths and mixing where required, so that you get a mixture of soft and hard materials, just to make it easier for the machine to fling it out the chute. But you know, apart from the problems, I've been very pleased with this machine. So that's about it for this particular video, and I'll catch you next time.